No one understood why the chief executive of a billion-dollar logistics empire kept lingering near the night cleaning cart long after the offices had emptied. Rowan Hale was, as far as anyone knew, a widowed single father who mopped floors in a faded uniform and said little to anyone, poor, tired, and entirely unremarkable. But when the board moved to strip Sloan Langford of her company over a scandal built on forged documents, that same quiet janitor walked into the boardroom, unclipped his name tag, and set down a heavy signet ring bearing the crest of Hale Capital. Only then did Sloan learn that the man she loved was the billionaire secretly testing her own company. If you want to know whether love survives a secret this large, stay with this story until the end and subscribe to the channel for more. Langford Meridian occupied 40 stories of glass above the Chicago River, and on the afternoon this story begins, its chief executive was fighting for the company's survival, one floor above the lobby, where a new janitor would soon push his cart for the first time. Sloan Langford sat across a long table from Conrad Whitmore, the silver-haired chairman of the board, who spoke in the gentle, reasonable tone he always used when demanding something cruel. Conrad wanted 900 employees gone by the end of the quarter, a bloodletting. He dressed up as fiscal discipline, sliding a spreadsheet across the table as though the names inside it were simply rounding errors waiting to be corrected. Beside him sat Grant Carrington, the chief financial officer, nodding along with the practiced sympathy of a man who had already decided the outcome long before the meeting began. Sloan refused to sign the layoff plan without reviewing every department herself, insisting that a company her father had spent 3 decades building deserved more than a single afternoon of arithmetic. Conrad reminded her not for the first time that compassion was a luxury her father's company could no longer afford, and that the market rewarded decisiveness far more than it rewarded sentiment. Sloan held his gaze until he looked away first, then gathered her papers and told the room she would review every proposal personally before a single position was eliminated, whether or not that answer pleased the men seated around the table. Word of the coming rescue investment traveled through the executive floor in whispers long before it reached the wider staff. No one outside, a small circle, knew the identity of the investor behind Hale Capital, only that a decision from his office within the next several weeks would determine whether Langford Meridian survived the year intact or was carved apart and sold in pieces. Sloan had met with intermediaries and lawyers representing the fund, but never once with the man himself, and she had begun to resent the anonymity, wondering what kind of person hid behind lawyers while deciding the fate of thousands of families he had never met. That same evening, a man calling himself Rowan Hart reported for his first shift with the cleaning contractor assigned to the 40th floor. He wore a uniform 2 sizes too large and pushed a cart with a wheel that stuck, and he made certain no one who passed him in the hallway saw anything worth remembering. His hands calloused from years of manual work, he insisted on doing himself even after his wealth made it unnecessary. Fit naturally around the handle of the cart, and nothing in his posture suggested a man accustomed to boardrooms and private jets. Beneath his collar, a small earpiece carried updates from Elliot Shaw, the independent auditor Rowan had quietly retained months earlier to review the company from the inside before any money changed hands. An anonymous complaint had reached Hale Capital, describing a company hiding fraud behind a friendly public face, alleging that senior leadership routinely falsified expense records and mistreated the very employees who kept the building running through the night, before committing $1.8 billion to rescue. Langford Meridian Rowan intended to see the truth for himself, without the polished executives always prepared for outside investors who arrived in suits and left within the hour. He had learned over many years of acquisitions that the version of a company shown to investors and the version experienced by its lowest paid employees were rarely the same company at all, and the only way to close that gap was to disappear into it completely. While wiping down a counter near the executive kitchen, Rowan watched Grant knock over a mug of coffee and then order an older cleaning woman to mop it up without so much as a glance in her direction, not even pausing his phone call to acknowledge that a person had appeared beside him to clean up his mess. Sloan appeared moments later, told Grant to apologize, and knelt down herself to help the woman whose name was Miriam Cole gather the broken pieces of the mug from the marble floor. Grant offered a clipped apology that carried no real weight behind it, and Sloane's expression made clear she had noted the difference between an apology given and an apology meant. Rowan noted the moment carefully, but did not yet trust it. Powerful people were skilled at performing kindness when they believed someone important might be watching, and he had learned the hard way, through years of studying companies from the outside, that a single gracious gesture proved nothing about a person's character until it repeated itself when no audience remained to witness it. When the room emptied, Sloan lingered behind to collect the folder she had left on the table, and she found the new janitor still standing near it, his eyes moving across a page of financial disclosures as though he understood every line, his lips moving faintly as he traced a column of figures. She asked, half amused and half suspicious, why a member of the cleaning staff would be reading a quarterly report instead of simply clearing the table. Rowan answered evenly that he used to run a small business of his own before his life changed, and though the words were technically true, they concealed a scale of truth Sloan could not have imagined in that moment. She noticed, almost against her will, that he had already caught an error the finance department had missed entirely, a shipping charge quietly counted twice in the ledger that, left uncorrected, would have cost the company a modest but real sum by year's end. She thanked him, filed the correction away in her memory, rather than dismissing it, and told herself it meant nothing more than a lucky guess from a man with an accountant's eye, even as some quieter part of her suspected otherwise. Over the following nights, Rowan began to see the building's true architecture, the one that never appeared in the glossy annual reports handed to shareholders each spring. Employees on the lower floors were timed on their breaks down to the minute, their badge swipes reviewed weekly by supervisors hunting for any excuse to write them up, while executives 2 floors above billed the company for dinners that cost more than a month of a receptionist's salary without ever facing a single question about it. Whenever Sloan walked the halls herself, everything transformed instantly into a tidy, rehearsed version of the company chairs, straightened and voices softened. Urgent phone calls quietly ended mid-sentence, and Rowan noted how quickly the performance dissolved the moment she stepped into an elevator and the door slid shut behind her. He also noticed that Grant and Conrad met after hours behind closed doors with a regularity that had nothing to do with ordinary business. Their conversations always ended the moment a cleaning cart rolled anywhere near the conference room. Rowan never touched a single confidential file, never opened a drawer that was not his to open. He recorded only what he observed with his own eyes, the hours, the patterns, the small cruelties, layered one on top of another until they formed something unmistakable, and he passed each detail to Elliot, who used it to request formal authorization for a deeper audit from the independent oversight committee overseeing the investment. One evening, a power failure trapped the two of them together in the lobby, the elevators dark and the guards busy elsewhere trying to restore the backup generators. Emergency lighting cast the marble floor in a dim amber glow, and for the first time since Rowan had arrived, there was no one else in the building to perform for, with no assistants and no board members nearby. Sloan admitted quietly, and without her usual armor, that she was trying to save the company her father had built for men who wanted only to sell it for parts and split the proceeds among themselves. She spoke of her father in fragments, a man who had built the company from 3 delivery trucks and a warehouse lease, who had never once told her she had done well, even after she pulled the company out of 2 separate crises before her 35th birthday. Rowan asked what she would do if saving the company meant losing her own position entirely. She told him without hesitation that a title mattered far less than the thousands of families whose lives depended on the choices made in that building, and that she would rather lose the chief executive seat with her conscience intact than keep it by abandoning the people who trusted her. Later that night, long after the lights had returned and Sloan had gone home, a message from Elliot reached Rowan's earpiece with news that unsettled him more than anything he had seen so far. The very numbers Sloan was relying on to save her company had been quietly altered before they ever reached her desk in a manner too deliberate to be mistaken for ordinary error. Rowan spent the following days tracing who held access to the financial systems, and every thread he pulled led back toward Grant, though the evidence remained buried under layers of shell companies designed to obscure a single hand at work. Sloan, meanwhile, had developed a habit of visiting the break room near the end of each shift, telling herself she simply wanted to hear from the people who actually worked inside the building, rather than the executives who reported to her secondhand. The truth, which she admitted to no one, was that she wanted to see Rowan. They shared coffee from the vending machine, the paper cups always slightly too hot to hold comfortably, and talked about things that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or falling stock prices. Sloan described a father who never once praised her in public, no matter how many crises she solved on his behalf, a man who believed affection made a person soft and unfit to lead. She recalled the night she was named chief executive, how she had waited for some private word of pride from him and received instead a list of concerns about how the market might react. Rowan spoke carefully about the wife he had lost, offering enough to be honest without opening a wound too wide, to close again in a hallway lit only by vending machine light. He described the ordinary weight of grief, the way it settled into small routines rather than dramatic moments, how he still set 2 cups down some mornings before remembering. He told her about raising his daughter alone and the constant fear that he could not rebuild a life while also being present for her. That every hour spent chasing a business decision felt like an hour stolen from a child who had already lost one parent. Sloan confessed that she could no longer tell whether people were drawn to her or simply to the name Langford stamped above the company's front doors, and that the uncertainty had made her suspicious of nearly everyone who tried to get close to her. She noticed that Rowan never asked her for anything, not money, not advancement, not a single favor that might explain his interest in her, not even the small courtesies other employees quietly angled for once they realized who she was. That absence of hunger made her feel for the first time in years that she could lower her guard around another person without immediately regretting it. Rowan in turn noticed that Sloane's kindness did not disappear when no one important was watching, that it survived in the smallest and least rewarded corners of the company. She had quietly preserved health coverage for employees nearing retirement, even when consultants recommended cutting it, and she had used part of her own bonus to keep a struggling wellness program alive, changes buried so deep in the budget that even her own board had never noticed them. Feelings began building between them, slow and unhurried, but Rowan deliberately kept his distance whenever he felt them growing too fast, aware that every hour Sloan trusted him made the eventual truth harder for either of them to survive. One night, gathering her coat near the elevator, Sloan asked if he would be willing to have dinner with her outside the building, away from titles and cameras and the version of themselves the office required. After a long pause, Rowan said yes. Sloan chose a small neighborhood restaurant instead of anywhere her name might draw attention, dressing simply, and asking her driver to stop a full block early so no one would connect the car to the meal. Rowan arrived in the battered pickup truck he had been using throughout his time undercover, its paint chipped along one door from years of ordinary use, and once again he behaved with the same quiet ease he always did, never flaunting anything, though his fluent grasp of investment strategy, fine wine, and corporate politics gave Sloan new reasons to wonder about the life he had left behind. When the waiter recommended a bottle from the middle of the list, Rowan asked a question about the vineyard soil that made the young man pause before answering, and Sloan filed the small detail away with all the others that did not quite fit the story he had given her. He explained only that he had once worked closely alongside wealthy people and had absorbed more from them than he expected. Another sentence built entirely from truth, arranged to hide the largest fact of all. The evening grew more honest as it went on, the restaurant emptying around them until only a few candles and the low hum of the kitchen remained. Sloan asked whether he felt any shame doing the work he did, now half expecting him to deflect the question the way most people did. Rowan told her that no honest job deserved shame, that the only shameful thing was using a title to make another person feel invisible, and that he had watched enough powerful people mistake authority for worth to know the difference clearly. The word struck somewhere deep inside her, forcing her to wonder whether she had already become one of the very board members she despised, the ones who measured a person's value by the size of their office. She admitted almost to herself that she sometimes caught her own voice sharpening into the same clipped tone Conrad used when speaking to people he considered beneath him, and that the realization frightened her more than any hostile takeover ever could. Elsewhere that same week, Elliot warned Rowan bluntly that dating the chief executive of a company under active investigation could unravel everything they had built toward exposing the fraud, jeopardizing not only the audit but the legal standing of every piece of evidence collected so far. Rowan promised to end it, a promise he genuinely intended to keep, but one he could not honor once Sloan began to open herself to him so completely that walking away felt indistinguishable from cruelty. By coincidence, Grant happened to see the two of them leaving the restaurant together that night. He did not know who the janitor truly was, but he understood immediately that the relationship could become a weapon against Sloan if handled correctly, and before the night was over, he had already instructed building security to quietly monitor the schedule and access records of the man who seemed to be getting far too close to the chief executive. Langford Meridian's annual gala arrived soon after an evening designed to convince nervous investors that the company remained as stable as its marble lobby suggested, even as Sloan privately knew the business had only a handful of months of cash remaining if the rescue deal collapsed. String lights and floral arrangements transformed the reception hall into something almost unrecognizable, and Sloan moved through the crowd, delivering the same reassuring answers to the same anxious questions, each one asked in a slightly different tone of polite disbelief. Rowan was assigned to clean the reception hall that night, folding linens and restocking glassware near the kitchen entrance, careful to remain unnoticed among the caterers and rented staff. Grant seized the opportunity to summon him in front of a crowd of guests, ordering him to wipe up a minor spill that catering staff had already handled, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the nearest cluster of investors. Grant added with a smile meant for the audience rather than for Rowan that some people ought to know their place rather than dreaming of a world that was never built for them, drawing a few uncomfortable laughs from the guests nearest him. Sloan heard every word and demanded Grant apologize to Rowan in front of the same guests who had just watched him humiliated. When Grant refused, she took the cloth from Rowan's hand, herself wiped the spill, and announced that anyone who could not respect the people working inside this building had no right representing Langford Meridian to anyone. The moment unsettled several board members who preferred their executives predictable, but it gave Rowan the answer he had been searching for since his first night on the job. Sloan defended the powerless, even when doing so cost her standing with the very investors she needed most. Later, alone on the rooftop terrace after the gala had ended, Sloan admitted how exhausted she had become, fighting people who seemed to be waiting for her to fail. Rowan came close to telling her everything in that moment, but Sloan spoke first, saying she valued him precisely because he was the only person in her life who wanted nothing from her, and her words closed the door he had almost opened. What followed was a brief quiet kiss, careful and full of feeling rather than spectacle. As the elevator carried him down afterward, a message arrived that changed the shape of everything. A shell company behind the suspicious transactions traced directly back to accounts controlled, jointly, by Grant Carrington and Conrad Whitmore. Rowan asked Elliot to accelerate the collection of evidence, determined to end his assignment and confess the truth to Sloan before she could hear it from anyone else. Elliot warned him that Conrad was already maneuvering to force a board vote, removing Sloan from her position, and that Conrad needed only a single ethical scandal to make her removal appear justified rather than political. In a brief encounter at a secondhand bookshop tucked between a bakery and a shuttered hardware store, Sloan crossed paths with Rowan and his daughter June, an 11-year-old with a serious, watchful face who was busy sorting through a stack of worn paperbacks in the corner. Rowan introduced Sloan simply as a colleague, and though June said nothing to give her father away in front of a stranger, she studied the exchange with the sharp attention children reserve for adults who are hiding something they think no one else can see. She noticed the way her father's voice softened when he spoke to this woman, a softness June had not heard directed at anyone since her mother had died, and she filed the observation away the way children often do, quietly and without a word. After Sloan left, promising to return the following week for a book Rowan had recommended, June asked her father quietly why he always told her that honesty mattered, yet had never told that woman the truth about who he was. Rowan had no answer he could give his daughter that night, and the silence between them lasted the entire walk home. Grant, growing desperate, arranged for the building's access logs to be altered so they would show Rowan entering the executive floor at the exact hour a confidential document had leaked. At the same time, he fabricated emails suggesting Sloan herself had shared sensitive material with a member of the cleaning staff. Security brought the falsified evidence to Sloan, directly informing her that the janitor she had grown close to might be stealing company data. Though the accusation shook her, she refused to condemn him without asking first, and she confronted Rowan directly, demanding to know who he truly was. Rowan told her honestly that he had never intended to cause her harm, but he still could not reveal the full truth while the audit remained in its final and most delicate stage, and Sloan heard that hesitation as an admission of guilt. Conrad wasted no time. He called an emergency board meeting and ordered Sloan to appear prepared to explain her secret relationship with an employee now suspected of stealing sensitive data. The meeting quickly became something closer to a public trial than a business discussion. Every chair around the long table filled, no empty seats left for sympathy. Conrad presented the falsified emails one by one, projecting them onto the wall behind him, followed by the altered access logs and a series of photographs showing Sloan dining with a man in a worn jacket outside a restaurant that meant nothing to anyone else in the room, but meant everything to her. Grant stood beside him and declared in the measured tone of a man reciting a script he had rehearsed for days that Sloan had leaked confidential information to a low-level employee, used her authority to shield a personal relationship, jeopardized the entire rescue deal with Hale Capital, and disqualified herself from leading the company any longer. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to meet Sloan's eyes as the accusations piled higher. Conrad offered her two paths forward: resignation on her own terms before the vote, or immediate removal by the board once it concluded, framing the choice as a mercy rather than the ultimatum it truly was. Grant pushed further, urging Sloan to publicly declare that Rowan had manipulated her for his own gain, promising that some members of the board might overlook the scandal if she cooperated. Sloan understood she stood on the edge of losing everything. Yet she refused to condemn a man on evidence she did not trust, telling the room plainly that whatever he was hiding, he had still treated every employee in this building with more decency than anyone currently seated at the table. Just as Conrad prepared to call for a vote, the door to the boardroom opened. Rowan walked in wearing his cleaning uniform, pushing the same battered cart he had used every night for 6 weeks, the wheels still catching faintly on the polished floor. A ripple of confusion moved through the room, board members glancing at one another, unsure whether a mistake had been made or a scene was about to unfold. Grant immediately ordered security to remove him, his voice rising with something close to alarm. But Elliot Shaw entered directly behind him, calm and unhurried, accompanied by the independent audit team he had assembled over the past several weeks. Rowan reached up, unclipped the name tag, reading Rowan Hart, and set it on the table beside the signet ring he had kept hidden until that moment, the metal catching the overhead light as it landed. He gave the room his true name: Rowan Hale, founder of Hale Capital and holder of the controlling debt that had kept Langford Meridian afloat through its most dangerous quarter, and for a long moment no one in the room spoke at all. He confirmed that his presence in the building had been authorized from the very beginning as part of a legitimate review, that his access records were entirely lawful, and that the emails used against Sloan had been fabricated. Elliot then presented documentation showing that Grant and Conrad had funneled tens of millions of dollars into consulting firms controlled by their own relatives, deliberately weakening the company so they could later acquire its most valuable assets at a fraction of their worth. The revelation left the room in stunned silence. The same man Grant had mocked for supposedly not knowing his place now held the power to decide the fate of everyone seated around that table, and yet Sloan felt no relief. She looked at Rowan and understood with a clarity that hurt more than the accusations themselves that every private moment between them had unfolded while he alone knew the truth and she did not. When Rowan said he could explain everything, Sloan answered quietly that he had spent weeks examining her entire company, and she wondered aloud whether her heart had simply been another line item in his report. After the meeting dispersed, Rowan found Sloan alone in her office. For the first time, he stood before her in a tailored suit that matched his real identity, though the sight of him this way only widened the distance between them rather than closing it. High explained that his disguise had begun long before he ever met her, that the investigation had targeted the entire system rather than her personally, that falling for her had never been part of any plan, and that every feeling he had shown her remained real despite everything he had concealed. Sloan told him that his feelings might well be genuine, but her own choices had not been made with full information. She had fallen for a man she believed shared the ordinary struggles of millions of people, while the entire time he held the power to shape her career, her reputation, and her future with a single decision. It wounded her most to remember confessing that she feared people only wanted access to the Langford name, a fear Rowan had heard clearly and chosen to let stand rather than correct. Rowan offered no defense, though every instinct in him wanted to argue, to explain, to find some sequence of words that might soften what he had done. He admitted instead that he had grown too accustomed to controlling every situation around him, that wealth had trained him to believe careful timing could excuse almost anything, and that he had been a coward, delaying the truth long after he should have spoken it aloud to her face. Sloan listened without interrupting. Her arms folded, her expression unreadable in a way he had never seen from her before, not even during the worst of the boardroom hearings. Sloan submitted her resignation the following morning, unwilling to remain chief executive under the authority of the very man she loved, unwilling to spend another year wondering which of her decisions were truly her own and which had simply been permitted by him. Though he had the power to reject her resignation outright, a single signature enough to erase it entirely, he chose not to, instead asking the board to delay any final decision and allow her the space to choose her own path forward without his influence hanging over the choice. She left the building without accepting any special compensation from Hale Capital, refusing even the standard severance package her contract entitled her to, unwilling to leave, carrying anything that might later be used to suggest her silence had been purchased. Conrad and Grant, suspended but not yet formally removed, leaked a distorted version of events to the press before losing their positions entirely, claiming Sloan had used a relationship with an investor to secure her own seat and had endangered the rescue deal for personal gain. Financial columnists picked up the story within hours, and Sloan's name appeared beside words she had spent her entire career trying to avoid: her reputation, absorbing fresh damage, even as the truth of the fraud remained unresolved and unreported, buried beneath a more sensational version of events that traveled far faster than any correction could. Rowan wanted to unleash his legal team against them without restraint, drafting the first of several aggressive letters before Elliot stopped him, reminding him that solving every problem through raw power would only prove Sloan's judgment of him correct, and that she needed to be believed on the strength of the truth alone, not defended into silence by his money. A few days later, Sloan received a thick folder from Miriam Cole, filled with statements from dozens of employees willing to speak on her behalf without any involvement from Rowan at all. Sloan chose not to disappear quietly. She was not returning for Rowan, and she was not returning for the title of chief executive. She was returning because silence would only let Conrad and Grant continue treating working people as expendable. She gathered Miriam several mid-level managers and employees who had been pressured into falsifying reports under Grant's direction. Elliot agreed to serve as independent counsel on the condition that Rowan step back entirely from directing any part of the strategy. Rowan accepted the condition, difficult as it was, marking the first time he had ever surrendered control over a situation in order to respect someone else's decision entirely. He sat in the back of the hearing room during the days that followed, silent, watching Sloan rebuild her case piece by piece without needing him to hand her a single answer. During the internal hearing that followed, Miriam described exactly how Grant treated the cleaning staff behind closed doors, recounting specific instances of shifts cut without warning and complaints quietly buried before they ever reached human resources. The accounting team confirmed that the disputed expenses had been fabricated, walking the panel through each altered invoice with a patience that left little room for doubt. Server records proved that the emails used against Sloan originated from Grant's own device, time-stamped in a way that made his denial collapse within minutes of being offered. Elliott traced the flow of money directly to an investment fund controlled by the Whitmore family, presenting a paper trail that stretched back nearly 2 years before the scheme was ever discovered, and Sloan demonstrated calmly, without a single raised word, that the plan to eliminate 900 jobs had been designed to destabilize the company rather than rescue it, a maneuver meant to drive down its value long enough for Conrad's allies to buy in cheaply. Conrad tried to shift every ounce of blame onto Grant alone, but Rowan appeared only as a witness, offering no threats and no financial pressure, refusing to cast himself as the hero of the story. The independent board ultimately removed Conrad from the chairmanship, terminated Grant's employment, and forwarded the fraud evidence to the appropriate authorities, resolving the matter through documented process rather than personal revenge. Sloan was invited to return as chief executive. She agreed only if Hale Capital signed a binding commitment protecting the autonomy of the leadership team and preventing the investment from ever being used to influence her personal life again. Rowan signed the agreement without negotiating a single clause. Once the room had emptied, Sloan found on her desk the same worn name tag Rowan had once worn as a janitor, resting beside an unopened letter. Inside the letter, Rowan did not ask her to come back to him. He simply admitted in plain and unadorned terms exactly where he had failed her without softening a single line or asking for sympathy anywhere in the writing. He wrote that he understood now why the timing of a truth could matter as much as the truth itself, and that he had mistaken his own good intentions for permission to withhold something she had every right to know from the beginning. He listed the changes he intended to make regardless of whether she ever forgave him, each one deliberate and irreversible. He would transfer a portion of Hale Capital's shares into an employee ownership fund, distributing real ownership rather than empty gratitude among the people who kept the company running. He would give up his voting rights on any matter directly concerning her, closing off permanently the possibility that his wealth could ever again shape a decision that belonged to her alone. He would make the full results of the audit public, so no innocent employee would ever be blamed for what Grant and Conrad had done in the shadows of their offices. He would fund a new training program without attaching the Hale name to any part of it, wanting no credit and no recognition for something that should have existed already. And once the company's restructuring was complete, he would step down from his board, entirely closing the last remaining door through which his influence might ever reach her again. 3 months passed. Sloan guided the company back towards stability, department by department, decision by decision, each small victory earned rather than given. Rowan kept every promise exactly as written, never calling, never sending gifts, never using June as a quiet excuse to see her again, even when the temptation to reach out grew almost unbearable during the loneliest evenings. Sloan began to notice in the careful silence he maintained that he was doing the hardest thing a man used to control could possibly do, which was accepting that she might never forgive him at all and living with that possibility without trying to bend it in his favor. She eventually found him at a community repair workshop on the city's south side, spending his weekends helping neighborhood residents fix cars and household appliances they could not otherwise afford to replace his hands stained with grease rather than folded behind a desk. He still dressed simply, but this time he made no effort to hide who he truly was. No false name pinned to his shirt, no careful story prepared in case anyone asked too many questions. When he looked up and saw her standing near the open garage door, he did not rush toward her or offer a rehearsed apology. He simply set down his tools and waited for her to speak first. Their conversation was not soft or easy. Sloan told him plainly that trust could not return simply because he had apologized once, that a single letter, however honest, could not undo months of decisions made without her knowledge. Rowan answered that he did not expect her to forget anything, that forgetting was never what he wanted from her. He only hoped for the chance to build something new, starting from nothing on terms she alone would set. Sloan laid out her terms without hesitation. No more secrets, no more hidden tests, and no more decisions about her life made quietly with his money. Rowan agreed to every condition. She did not offer full forgiveness in that single conversation. She simply asked whether he would like a cup of coffee from a vending machine, the same way they once shared one before either of them knew what the other truly was. Rowan smiled and told her that this time she would know exactly who was sitting across from her. A year later, Langford Meridian had returned to profitability. Without a single mass layoff, its recovery built not on cutting people but on cutting the waste that Conrad and Grant had hidden for years. The company established an employee advisory council with real authority over working conditions and adopted new protections for contract workers who had once been treated as invisible by the executives above them, protections drafted in part from testimony Miriam and dozens of others had given during the hearing that ended Grant's career. Sloan remained chief executive, her leadership now trusted by a board that had learned at considerable cost what happened when it ignored her judgment. Rowan remained a billionaire, though he held no operating role inside her company and made a point of arriving to public events without the entourage such men usually kept close. The two of them built their relationship slowly and openly, without any hidden imbalance of power standing between them, each decision made in full view of the other rather than negotiated behind closed doors. June appeared briefly at the company's anniversary celebration, teasing her father that this time he had told the truth from the very beginning, a joke that made him laugh harder than anything had in months. Her friendship with Sloan had grown naturally over that year, built on shared jokes and quiet weekend visits rather than obligation, and never once asked to replace the mother June had lost far too young. During the celebration, a young server accidentally spilled a tray of water in front of a room full of investors, the glasses scattering across the floor with a sound loud enough to silence half the conversations nearby, and the entire hall fell still, watching to see how the chief executive would respond to the small disaster unfolding at her feet. It was the kind of moment that a year earlier might have ended with a quiet reprimand delivered later in private, the server's name noted somewhere it should never have been written. Sloan knelt without hesitation to help the young man gather the fallen glasses, waving away the two staff members who rushed forward to take over for her. Rowan stepped forward as well, removed his jacket without a second thought, and knelt beside her to help clean the floor, his tailored sleeves brushing against the same marble he had once mopped under a different name. No one in that room dared to laugh at either of them, and several guests who had spent the evening discussing quarterly projections found themselves watching the two of them, instead unsure what to make of it. When Sloan introduced Rowan to the guests around her a few minutes later, she did not call him the chairman of Hale Capital, and she did not call him the billionaire who had rescued Langford Meridian from ruined titles that would have meant something to every investor in the room. She called him simply the man who had learned to let her make her own choices, a description that confused several of the guests and required no further explanation for either of them. Rowan had walked into her company to test how it treated people who held no power at all. In the end, the hardest test he faced belonged to no one but himself, and only after removing every disguise he had ever worn did he finally become the man Sloan truly chose to love. If you made it this far, you clearly care how these two turned out. So do me a favor, subscribe so the next story finds you, and tell me in the comments, could you forgive a secret that big, or did Rowan cross a line that no letter could ever repair? I read every reply.